There are saints who comfort. And there are those whose lives reveal the severe face of faith. When no sign remains, when all that is felt is absence. And when tuberculosis began to consume her lungs, she entered her last and hardest darkness. That of the body dissolving while the soul, without any sensible spark, continues to believe. This is the story of the true Thérèse. Not the fragile flower that is imagined, but the root hidden in the cold earth. The young woman who found God not in the light, but in the oppressive darkness. Thérèse of Lisieux died at the age of 24, behind the walls of a Norman Carmelite monastery, in 1897. The world enveloped her in the delicate diminutive of little flower. A docile, almost childlike symbol of spiritual tenderness. But this sweetness is a later construction. A devotional invention that diluted the truth. Because Thérèse did not germinate in any garden. She blossomed in the deepest winter of the soul. She lived for years under an inner darkness so dense, she could barely breathe. She fought against scruples that corroded her since childhood. He faced spiritual aridity that did not yield even to her monastic determination. In her later writings, Thérèse confesses the temptation to doubt heaven itself. A dark night that offered no visions, no consolations, no flashes of light. Jesus permitted my soul to be invaded by the thickest darkness. The thought of heaven, so sweet to me since my childhood, is now no more than a struggle and a torture. Her sanctity is not in the sweetness of holy cards. It is in the disconcerting fact that she remained. Not because she felt God, but because she chose not to abandon him when he seemed completely absent. Thérèse found God not in the light, but in the oppressive darkness. Marie-Françoise Thérèse Martin was born in 1873 in Alsace, France. The youngest of 9 children, for already deceased before she took her first breath. Death haunted that family like a familiar presence. It was not the exception. It was the air they breathed. At age 4, her mother, Zélie, died of breast cancer. Thérèse would later describe it. The second part of my life began with the death of my mother. Something broke in her. From a cheerful and expansive child, she became timid, extremely sensitive, crying over anything. She cried compulsively. She felt guilty about everything. She lived in a constant state of alert, as if the whole world could collapse at any moment. At age 6, the crises began. Uncontrollable tremors. Visions that no one else saw. Periods when the words simply would not come out. The doctors examined her, disconcerted. There was no fever. There was no visible cause. The body was trying to say what could not be contained in a child's words. It was then that the spiritual night began to take shape. Upon this fragility weighed the atmosphere of the Martin household. Louis, her father, was a man of silent and profound faith. Religion there was not easy comfort, it was an inner call, constant vigilance. God was present in everything, seeing everything, weighing everything. Thérèse absorbed this atmosphere like a sponge. But instead of security, she found anguish. God was a distant horizon. A gaze she feared she could not sustain. And from this tension, scruples were born. Scruples, that spiritual torture in which a person constantly feels they are in sin, even without having committed any fault. Thérèse confessed the same sins repeatedly. She feared that every thought was a mortal offense. She lived in terror of eternal damnation. At ages 8, 9, 10, a child obsessed with her own perdition. She sought a God who seemed to recede the closer she came. At age 9, her sister Pauline entered the Carmelite convent. Another loss. Another surrogate mother who disappeared behind convent bars. Thérèse spent weeks trembling, delirious. As if every abandonment reopened all the previous wounds, right back to the first. It was in this context that Thérèse began to build her relationship with God. Not childish sweetness. Not innocent trust. But fear. Inadequacy. A thirst for something greater mixed with the certainty that something was profoundly wrong inside her. And that God, in his silence, perhaps agreed. The darkness did not begin in the Carmelite convent. It was born with Thérèse. It grew with her, day after day, like a shadow glued to her soul since childhood. And when she crossed the convent doors at age 15, she was not running from this shadow. She was taking it with her. Between the ages of 11 and 13, Thérèse went through what she would call the most painful period of my life. Not due to external events, but because of the inner torture of scruples. Scruple is a word that has lost its weight. Today it seems minor. But, in the spiritual vocabulary of the 19th century, it named one of the cruelest forms of religious suffering, the inability to believe in one's own innocence. The obsessive certainty of always being at fault before God. Thérèse confessed the same thoughts day after day. She received absolution. She left relieved for a few minutes. Then, the same fear returned, like a dull blade. What if I didn't say everything? What if my contrition wasn't true? What if I offended God without realizing it? The cycle began again. Without end. Her sister Marie witnessed this time. She saw Thérèse in a constant state of anxiety, examining her own conscience with a rigor no child should have to bear. Every word spoken during the day was reviewed at night. Every gesture, dissected. Every intention, suspected of guilt. Behind this vigilance was something even darker, the image of a severe, silent God, almost impossible to please. Thérèse did not fear the abstract hell of sermons, but a divine gaze that would fall upon her and find only fault, inadequacy, and sin. She sought absolute purity. But the more she sought it, the more impure she felt. In the Carmelite convent, the darkness would cease to be fear and would become the very substance of faith. The scruples were not just moral. They were theological. Thérèse began to doubt her very salvation. She read about the saints and felt infinitely distant from them. She heard about divine mercy and could not apply it to herself. Grace seemed destined for everyone but her. God was present, but as a silent judge. As a gaze that weighs and rarely approves. This was her first spiritual night. She would write. Only those who have been through it can understand the martyrdom that scruples represent. Martyrdom without blood. Guilt without name. Anguish that does not cease. Thérèse entered the Carmelite convent of Lisieux with the silent conviction that there, at last, she would find the one whose absence had marked her entire childhood. She dreamed of intimacy, presence, and consolation. She found silence. In the first months, novelty sustained her soul, the austere liturgy, the daily schedule, the cold cloister at dawn. Then, everything became repetition. Prayer, once desired, became effort without echo. She wrote later. During my prayers, I almost always fell asleep. God did not give me the gift of contemplation. But sleep was not the core of the problem. It was a symptom. The true center was absence, God could not be felt. The Eucharist, received daily, was crossed by the same dryness. No warmth. No light. The spiritual life had become pure discipline, a faithfulness sustained only by the decision to carry on. Her faith did not ascend. It descended. Her inner life did not become brighter. It grew darker. And Thérèse remained. The dryness did not retreat. It remade itself, deeper. And it was in this state of soul that tuberculosis found her. In April of 1896, on the night of Holy Thursday, Thérèse had her first hemoptysis. She woke with the sensation of something warm rising in her throat. She brought her handkerchief to her lips. Blood. Pulmonary tuberculosis. At that time, a slow, announced death sentence. She was 23 years old. And she immediately understood the meaning of that sign. She thought that, at last, her pilgrimage was reaching its end and that she could leave the exile of earth to meet God face to face. But the final lesson would not be a meeting. It would be a desert. The night, until then endured, became an abyss. Because, with the illness, came the temptation against hope. Thérèse would write, "He permitted my soul to be invaded by the thickest darkness, and that the thought of heaven, once so familiar, would become a source of struggle and bitterness." While her body slowly dissolved, Thérèse lost the certainty of the resurrection. The very perception of God's existence. Everything was reduced to a single choice, believing without any inner evidence. Thus she wrote, "I sit at the table of sinners. I do not dare raise my eyes to heaven. And also, I believe there was never a creature who had more materialistic thoughts than mine." Inside a Carmelite convent, she was tempted toward atheism while she was dying. The illness advanced with cruel regularity. Fever, suffocation, incessant coughing. But the greatest torment was invisible, the spiritual desert. Around her, the sisters saw serenity, sweetness, and recollection. They did not know of the struggle. They did not know that she prayed without feeling anything, took communion without any warmth, and hoped without a horizon. In June of 1897, she was transferred to the infirmary. She would never leave it again. Her final months were progressive suffering. Physical pain, the slow depletion of breath, fever. And within, the same temptation to despair. To the prioress, she confessed, "If you only knew what darkness surrounds me. I no longer believe in eternal life. It seems to me that, after this life, nothing exists. Everything has disappeared for me. All that remains for me is love." Her last words were not a triumph. They were a plea, "My God, I love you." Not a limpid declaration. But a word hurled into a silence that persisted. And until her final instant, God remained veiled. No final consolation. No light that descended to welcome her. Thérèse's sanctity does not rest on visions, because she had none. It does not rest on ecstasies, because she never experienced them. She is a saint because she remained. She remained when God seemed absent. She remained when faith seemed impossible. She remained when death approached, promising nothing but darkness. Often imagined as a luminous flower, she died in the darkness. And it was precisely this that made her a saint. In the manuscripts she left behind, the apparent delicacy dissolves. And that sanctity is not measured by feeling, but by silent perseverance. The way Thérèse called little is not born of tenderness. It is born of misery itself. Surrender without guarantees. Trust that remains even when it finds only silence. Thérèse knew the night described by St. John of the Cross. But she knew the night without mystical counterbalances. Without flashes of relief. And she walked within it. What do we do when God does not answer? What sustains faith when feeling is extinguished? How do we remain when no meaning remains? To those who live in the night, her lesson remains. Do not wait for the dawn, but sink roots into the darkness itself. The little flower did not bloom from the light. She bloomed from the winter. And she remained.